Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin, but you can call me Jean. Here's a self-portrait I made when I was about 3 years old. Back in 2022, when I was about to become a history teacher, I had to pass a sort of exam called the Agrégation externe d'histoire. In order to do that, the list of subjects I could be interrogated on included, but was definitely not limited to, Evergetism in the Roman world, 1st century before the Common Era, 4th century of the Common Era. Political regime and monumentality in the Italian communes, 12th century to the 14th century of the Common Era. Being a mother in France in the 18th century, or South Africa from 1899 to 1991. When I did start teaching, though, I rapidly realized that the 12-year-olds I was put in charge of did not really care about whatever the hell Evergetism is. What a surprise. I do, however, remember one of them asking me during a lesson about what constituted Roman culture, how much it cost to go to the public bath in Rome. Now, I just couldn't answer her on the spot, and I realized that all my training had made me forget about some very basic things. Many of my teacher friends also talked about similar difficulties and the experience of being caught off guard by very simple and very legitimate questions from the kids. As a result, I thought I would try my hand at this YouTube thing to do some overview videos about different subjects of history, which would, if anything, help me get things straight thanks to the research I do to prepare them. As a starting point, I therefore decided to take on Roman history, and more specifically, the history of the foundation of the city of Rome itself. Ancient Rome. When you think about it, you might be surprised to hear that it lasted more than 1,000 years, from the commonly accepted dates of 753 before the Common Era, all the way until 476 of the Common Era. We tend to have a very flat idea of what ancient Rome was, as evidenced by this little experiment that I ran with a panel of friends and family. I asked them the very simple question, if I tell you ancient Rome, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And here's the answers I got in return. So we've got statues of Caesar or Augustus, we've got the Colosseum twice, we've got Caesar again, we've got the Roman legions. I also asked my brother for the first thing that comes to his mind, and he gave me 5, including a Roman legionary, the Testudo, the Senate, Asterix and Obelix, an aqueduct, and I also had one friend who answered this. So, you see, the stuff we most commonly associate with ancient Rome comes from a particular period of ancient Rome, the late Republic and early Empire years, roughly between 100 BCE and 100 CE. This leads to a very flat impression of what it actually was, with huge unknown areas where our mind tends to copy-paste the information that it already has. What was Rome in the 5th century BCE? Well, I don't know, probably some place where they had marble statues around and probably walked in Testudo formation or something. Today I thought I would try and tell you what Rome was like during these early years, thanks to what modern historians and archaeologists have discovered, starting with how the city itself came to be, through all the legends and myths that shroud its foundation. The date of the foundation of the city of Rome has been the subject of many squabbles, basically since Roman history has been a thing. Greek historian Timaeus of Tauromenion, who lived from 350 to 260 before the Common Era, put it at around 814 BCE, while his earliest known Roman homologue, Fabius Pictor, who lived from 270 to 200 before the Common Era, preferred the date of 748. The most commonly cited date nowadays, 753 BCE, was put forward by Marcus Terentius Varro, who lived during the 1st century before the Common Era, on the simple basis that the Roman Republic had been proclaimed in 509 BCE, as every Roman citizen knew, and that there had been 7 kings of Rome prior to the birth of the Republic, as every Roman citizen knew. He decided that each reign must have lasted around 35 years, because of reasons, and therefore counted 7 times 35 back from 509, which led to 753 BCE. The legend that we are familiar with in the modern day concerning the beginnings of Rome follows first the exile of Aeneas from Troy, carrying his dad on his back through the Mediterranean, until eventually he ends up in the region of Rome, where his son Ascanius creates the city of Alba Longa. Sometime later, the daughter of Alba's king, Rhea Silvia, becomes pregnant with twins after being raped by the god Mars. Raised away from the city by peasants, Romulus and Remus, as they are known, discover their royal ascent and re-establish their grandfather, who had been dethroned by a usurper, before setting off to create their own city to rule. After finding a convenient site, the twins need to choose who's going to be king, so they start watching for signs from the gods. Remus sees a flight of 6 vultures first, but Romulus sees 12 vultures second. A fight ensues where Romulus kills his brother, and therefore becomes the first king of the new city to which he gives his name, Rome. However, this legend, which is the most commonly known nowadays, is only one of the versions that exist. Some authors, like Hellanicos of Lesbos, Damastes of Sigeum, or even Sallustius, contended that Aeneas was the one that founded Rome. According to Ennius, the twins were actually Aeneas' grandsons. Now, you might have picked up on something important when I talked about Fabius Pictor. He is widely regarded as the earliest known Roman historian, but he only lived in the 3rd century BCE, more than 400 years after the legendary foundation of Rome. This exemplifies the main problem when dealing with early Roman history. The written record of the city only really begins at that time, and leaves us with nothing but legends and archaeological evidence to establish the early founding years. The Romans themselves were very aware of that, as is best seen in the work of Livy, who wrote the following in the introduction to his main work, Ab Urbe Condita, or From the Foundation of the City. The traditions of what happened prior to the foundation of the city, or whilst it was being built, are more fitted to adorn the creations of the poet than the authentic records of the historian, and I have no intention of establishing either their truth or their falsehood. This much license is conceded to the ancients that, by intermingling human actions with divine, they may confer a more august dignity on the origins of states. Faced with this, 18th century erudites like Louis de Beaufort called all of these legends unusable and birthed a hypercritical historiographical approach, basically saying that we couldn't really do Roman history before the 4th century, when Greek historians started writing about it. After the end of World War II, however, archaeologists like Andrea Carandini tried to rehabilitate the legends as more trustworthy sources, thanks to the discovery of 8th century dwellings on the Palatine Hill, that, according to them, would corroborate the idea of a Romulian foundation. Nowadays, it is generally thought that this line of thinking was a little flimsy, and that the legends, although they can be used to make some really interesting deductions when cross-referenced with archaeological evidence, are not a trustworthy account of what really went down, as the dates presented by these legends were arbitrarily chosen, and we have zero proof that the characters actually existed. Now, what does archaeology tell us of the foundation of Rome? First things first, Rome did not actually pop out of existence in a previously unsettled place thanks to the action of a providential founder king, as depicted in legends. Central Italy had been populated for hundreds of thousands of years, as evidenced by the human remains found at Sacco Pastore, a few kilometers away from Rome proper, where 2 Neanderthal skulls were discovered in the 1930s. They were initially estimated at 125,000 years old, until a new study in 2015 pushed back the date to 250,000 years old. making them the oldest Neanderthal fossils found in Italy. A little further from the city, Bracciano Lake houses within its depth a lakeside village from around 5500 BCE, a fascinating site that deserves a video in its own right, showing that the inhabitants of the region were already accustomed to living within settlements, as many other Neolithic villages were found, and it is not impossible that the site of Rome itself housed one or more of these early small towns, as pottery dating back to the 14th century before the Common Era was found on the slopes of the Capitoline Hill, one of the summits that constitute the birthplace of Rome. Using simple logic, we can also deduce that Rome was probably settled much earlier than legends tell, because it is a pretty good place to settle, simply put. The place itself is made of easily defended hills, surrounded by the marshy floodlands of the Tiber River. It is near a safe crossing along the same river, making it a strategic place on the way between the Etruscan cities of Etruria and Campania. Finally, following the valley of the Tiber leads to salt-producing ponds, making Rome an important salt trading spot for the populations of the mountains of central Italy, making it an auspicious site for any Neolithic tribe to establish themselves. Finally, the very conservative nature of Roman society and religion meant that they never abandoned an institution or a ritual, even if they no longer needed it or no longer understood the meaning of it. It therefore appears that some of those institutions or rituals might have originated from the village communities that preceded the apparition of the city of Rome proper, as is the case for the Septimontium celebration. According to Festus Grammaticus, this celebration took place every year and was mostly made of a procession that went from the Palatine Hill to the Velia, the Fagutalis, the plain of Suburra, the Germalis, the Oppius, the Caelius, and ended on the Cispius. This may indicate the existence of a sort of ancient league that would have united the villages that sat in those particular places. Another ancient celebration, the Feriae Latinae, seemed to show that these pre-Roman settlements were also integrated in a larger kind of religious league that united all the villages of Latin culture around the cult of Jupiter Latiaris, the oldest attested form of worship to Jupiter, which was celebrated in the Alban Mount. This leads us to note that Rome didn't appear in a vacuum, but was rather a part of a culture it shared with other settlements of the Latium, established by migrating Italic tribes coming from Central Europe between 1200 and 900 BCE, the Latial culture being a sort of offshoot of the Proto-Villanovan culture, itself derived from the Urnfield cultures of Central Europe. The development of this Latial or Latin culture can be seen with common funerary practices in the Latium, as exemplified by many archaeological sites like the necropolis of Osteria dell'Ossa, notable for being the site of discovery of the oldest writing found in Italy that we know of. This ancient community of villages that sat on top of different hills then seems to have undergone significant changes around the 8th century before the Common Era. The Latin villages seem to have been ruled by a sort of aristocratic elite, whose existence can be deduced from the richness of their tombs, like the ones found in Castel di Decima. There, silver and gold jewelry were found, like fibulae, as well as many weapons, including a whole war chariot, indicating that this aristocracy derived prestige from its military strength. They seem to have decided to unify into a common political entity, otherwise known as a city. This can be seen with the abandonment of the necropolis that sat in what would later become the Roman Forum. As in the ancient world, it was customary to not include cemeteries in the limits of your settlements. If a cemetery is suddenly abandoned, one of the reasons might therefore be that the unification of Rome led to the entirety of the necropolis, which originally sat between villages, to now be in the middle of a bigger city. This unification, known in historian jargon as a Sinoecism, would then slowly be strengthened during the course of the 7th century, with the adjunction of a common ground to discuss political matters, as the space left by the former cemetery was paved to be transformed into the forum, and the first common civic cults started to appear, most notably the Temple of Vesta and the temples of the Capitoline Triad, that is to say, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Finally, by around 620 BCE, Rome was definitely born as a fully fledged urban polity. One final element edified during this rough period of time is the Regia, house of the city's leader, which leads us to one simple question. Who was he? Here we face off against the lack of sources again. As mentioned earlier, traditions give us a list of 7 kings, who reigned between 753 and 509 before the Common Era, starting with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud. And again, even the legends differ between themselves, as they do with the archaeology, as other names are sometimes given or found of persons who seem to have controlled the city. Names like Hostus Hostilius, Aulus and Caelius Vibena, Lars Porsena, that you see nowhere on the list and whose existence sometimes remain very uncertain. Each of the legendary king of Rome is accredited with having had an important role. Romulus is obviously the founding father of the city and is said to have instituted important things like the Senate. Numa Pompilius organized the Roman religion. Tullius Hostilius conquered the rival city of Alba Longa and others, while Ancus Marcius created the port of Ostia. What we can deduce is that the king fulfilled a mostly religious and military role, leading the army when needed and fulfilling the role of an intermediary between the communities of men and gods. The king was probably chosen by an assembly of the aristocrats that formerly led the village communities, which formed a proto-senate of proto-patricians and had to listen to their counsel and will. In fact, it is likely that the monarch of 7th century Rome served as a moderating, balancing and unifying figure between the formerly sovereign families of the villages that now had to share power between themselves, and that still in fact had a monopoly on political power in the new polity that they had created, meaning the king was probably more of a sort of figurehead in these times. It is very possible that from the start, Rome was amongst the biggest cities in Italy. We know that thanks to the archaeological remains of the city's walls that were built during the 6th century. They include an area of almost 300 hectares and tell us that the city might have housed, although that is a very rough estimate, around 35,000 people. The wall itself was largely rebuilt during the 4th century before the Common Era, not necessarily in the same place, but pottery fragments dating back to the 6th century, found at the base of the walls, do indicate that their foundation must have dated from that period, and they therefore offer a view of the area covered by the city at that point. The city looked more and more monumental, not only due to the construction of temples and public buildings, but also due to the adoption of a new form of building for houses, using limestone foundations and tile roofs, definitely moving away from the village dwellings during this 6th century. Such monuments, newly built, included the Curia Hostilia, to house the Senate, the Temple of Capitoline Jupiter, and the Cloaca Maxima, an ancient sewer system. This big city logically would have taken a pretty important role in the Latin League, especially when it took control of the Jupiter Latiaris cult site in the Alban Mount, which might have been recorded in the legends as the destruction of Alba Longa by Tullius Hostilius. The installation of its own version of the cult of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, along with a cult to Diana, another deity important to the Latins, on the Aventine Hill, can be interpreted as signs of this new dominating role in the Latium. It would also have been an economical powerhouse, taking complete control over the salt trade with the foundation of Ostia, and exploiting the rich floodlands of the Tiber Valley to grow grains and olive trees, as indicated by the archaeological remains of a 6th century farm found beneath the current-day Auditorium Parco della Musica. The development of Rome can also be deduced from the appearance of numerous tombs dedicated to foreigners, who likely came to the city seeking work, or maybe for commerce, with Etruscan inscriptions becoming quite common from the start of the 6th century. The economical and demographical growth of the city logically led to the progressive weakening of the original patricians from the proto-urban villages, as they and their clientele constituted a smaller and smaller minority. At the same time, it is likely that political changes were brewing, as the power of the king started sidelining this clinging aristocracy, by gaining the good graces of the growing masses, excluded from partaking in the political life of the city by the power of the Senate. For example, the legendary retellings of the reign of Tarquinius the Proud describe him as an archetypal tyrant. It is even theorized by Tim Cornell that the kings of the 6th century were not actually kings, but rather tyrants who relegated the Roman king to purely religious duties as the Rex Sacrorum, or king of the sacred things, a religious role that survived way until the Common Era. In theory, thus, the royalty never technically got abolished in Rome, even when it became a republic. Such an evolution, with the installation of a unifying monarchical or tyrannical power in a city, occurred elsewhere in the Mediterranean world during the 7th and 6th century before the Common Era, included in Italy. The tyrants Pisistrates of Athens, Aristodemos of the city of Cumae, the Etruscan kings, Porsena and Tephariawelanias. Rome is therefore not a unique case, and the fact that it evolved from a monarchy to a tyranny would be in line with the rest of the world. We also have more clues about the identity of these tyrants or kings than we had about the purely legendary 7th century ones, although the evidence is still fragmentary at best. According to the canon legends, Rome had 3 kings in the 6th century: Tarquinius the Elder, Servus Tullius, and Tarquinius the Proud, who were of Etruscan and not Latin origins. Concurrently, the Etruscans also had legends about these characters, especially about Servus Tullius. In a 4th century Etruscan archaeological site called the François Tomb, found to the north of Rome, mosaics have been discovered that depict the brothers Aulus and Caelius Vibena, accompanied by someone called Mastarna, fighting against enemies amongst which one Gnaeus Tarquinius can be discerned. Now, the second clue is a speech pronounced by Emperor Claudius in front of the Senate, during which he says that Servus Tullius' name before he came to Rome was Mastarna. Therefore, here we see 3 characters that have been at one point or another called by Roman historians kings of Rome, killing a 4th character with the family name of other traditional kings of Rome. The confluence of the Latin and Etruscan legend does seem to suggest that the throne of Rome during the 6th century was a bit of a hot seat, with adventurers and warlords from other regions of Italy competing between themselves and with the local Latin oligarchy for power. Some of these warlords, like the Tarquinians, might even have tried to establish a hereditary succession within their family. All the while, the city kept growing and flourishing, thus making it an even more tempting prize. A new sort of royal ideology seems to have developed during the 6th century, moving away from the moderating position of a king controlled by a patrician aristocracy. This can be seen thanks to the remains found under the sanctuary of San Tomobono. There, an exceptionally well-preserved 6th century temple has been excavated, along with statues and other decorations. These decorations seem to mostly be dedicated to Hercules, led by the goddess Minerva. The construction of this new temple by the city's leader seemed to indicate that they wanted to show their power, free of others, thanks to the reference to Hercules. He is the prototype of the mighty hero, personally favored by the gods, who ends up gaining immortality, and the use of his cult has been documented for other tyrants like the previously cited Pisistrates or Aristodemos, to show that they hold their power thanks to their strength and are not accountable to others. All of this would suddenly come crashing down at the end of the 6th century when the royalty was cast down and replaced by the Roman Republic. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but the written records are only made of legends and myths and cannot be taken as good sources for what happened. According to our main man Livy, in 509 before the Common Era, the following happened. It was there that Sextus Tarquinius was seized with a wicked desire to debauch Lucretia by force. Not only her beauty, but her proved chastity as well provoked him. Burning with passion, he waited till it seemed to him that all about him was secure and everybody was fast asleep. Drawing his sword, he came to the sleeping Lucretia. Holding the woman down with his left hand on her breast, he said, "Be still, Lucretia. I am Sextus Tarquinius. My sword is in my hand. Utter a sound and you die." At this dreadful prospect, her resolute modesty was overcome, as if with force, by his victorious lust, and Tarquinius departed, exulting in his conquest of a woman's honor. Lucretia, after being raped by Tarquinius, goes to her family and says the following. Sextus Tarquinius is he that last night returned hostility for hospitality, and armed with force brought ruin on me, and on himself no less, if you are men, when he worked his pleasure with me. The men in the family give their pledges, every man in turn. Then Lucretia, taking a knife which she had concealed beneath her dress, plunges it into her heart, and sinking forward upon the wound, died as she fell. By this blood most chaste, until a prince wronged it, I swear, and I take you, gods, to witness, that I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and his wicked wife and all his children with sword, with fire, aye, with whatsoever violence I may, and that I will suffer neither them nor any other to be king in Rome. So, the Roman people, subtle as they were, described the transition from the monarchy to the republic as the consequence of a sexual assault, which was then followed by a revolution, during which Tarquinius Collatinus, Lucretia's husband, Brutus, his cousin, and a few other characters chased the king Tarquinius the Proud and his family from the city, and proclaimed themselves consuls, ruling the newly established regime under the acclaim of the Roman people, finally free of the tyrannical king. Now you don't need to be a top-notch historian to see where the legend might be a little sus. For the kids at the back of the class, here's a little help. I've highlighted the relevant passages on my script. Anything comes to mind yet? Tarquinius the Proud and Tarquinius Collatinus are obviously from the same family. In fact, Brutus is, according to the legends, the king's nephew. This has led historians like Tim Cornell to postulate that what really might have happened wasn't some kind of popular revolt due to a tyrannical act, but rather a coup inside the royal family, where the old Tarquinian dynasty king was too old and weak to enforce his rule correctly, thus leading his younger relatives to replace him. However, as none of them were individually strong enough to secure the throne, they instead installed a collegial oligarchy that would later evolve, during the 5th century, to become what we now know as the Roman Republic. This again would be concordant with the general evolution of Mediterranean civilization, as it is around these times that Athens would get rid of the heir of Pisistratus to install the now famous world's first democracy, where only 10% of people could actually vote, and many Etruscan cities would also transition from a monarchy to a collegial aristocracy type of government. But this is not the end of the kings of Rome, as we now need to talk about what I personally think is the most fascinating part of this whole thing, the story of Lars Porsena. Legends tell that Tarquinius the Proud, seeing the city now closed to him, fled back to Etruria, where Porsena, king of Clusium, lent a sympathetic ear to his plight. He would lay siege to Rome in an effort to give it back to its rightful ruler, which would be the occasion for many a young Roman to become a hero. Horatius Cocles, also known as Horatius the One-Eyed, would solo the entire Etruscan army on the Sublicius Bridge, giving time for the Romans to cut the bridge and save the city from occupation. Later during the siege, Caius Mucius Scaevola would sneak into the Etruscan camp and try to assassinate Porsena. would get caught in the process and then would willingly, during an interrogation, put his right hand in a fire, swearing that 300 young Romans were ready to do the same just to get a chance to kill the king. After that, Porsenna, understandably spooked, would negotiate a peace with the Romans and go back home, trying to pillage the city of Aricia on the way back, and the Roman Republic lived happily ever after. What do historians make of this mess? Well, it is likely that, seeing political turmoil as a sign of weakness, a nearby Etruscan warlord would try and conquer the city, as many had done before, as we've seen. This Porsenna guy would be successful in this regard and temporarily become the new king of Rome, but in doing that, would anger the rest of the Latin League, understandably, as the Tarquinian dynasty would have probably been deeply linked to the ruling aristocracies of these cities after years and years of rule, as well as the Greek city of Cumae, which opposed Etruscan expansion. The army of Porsenna would get beaten at the Battle of Aricia by the combined forces of Cumae and the Latin cities, leaving a power vacuum in Rome, which then would have been filled by the local aristocracy re-establishing their collegial power. And that's where we're gonna leave it for now, as this video has already been way too long to make for me. A huge thank you to a few of the people around me that really helped me and supported me in the making of this, specifically Elise, Jeanne and Melissa. A huge thank you to you. If you're looking to know how I made this video, I'm gonna link every resource I can in the description, and I might as well show you that this is the main book I used to make this video. It's in French, sadly. If you found this video interesting or informative in any way, don't hesitate to leave a like and maybe tell a friend about it. It's like I'm a real YouTuber, imagine that. If you have a question or something didn't seem clear to you, don't hesitate to ask in the comments and I'll do my best to answer you. I will probably come back at some point to talk more about Roman history, although if I do make another video, it will probably be about another period of history. In the meantime, everyone, take care of yourselves and have a nice day.